Hello, good morning and welcome everybody. It is Tuesday, July the 15th, the day we find out what Donald Trump really thinks about the Prime Minister, Brexit and that state visit. My name's Anne McElvoy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's, the podcast that gives you everything you need about the day ahead in British politics in around 20 minutes. And today, Anne, I'm going to be asking a difficult question. And I'm almost worried to say it out loud. Are Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules as ironclad as the Treasury says? And then pretty much I'm going to duck and run out the door.
Shock. I don't even quite know what you're going to tell us there, so we'll find out a bit later, Sam. So we wake up to discover that Donald Trump thinks that Britain's handling of Brexit was on the sloppy side, but getting better. He says, I really like the Prime Minister, even though he's a Liberal. High praise indeed. But he seems unbothered that he won't be able to address MPs on his unprecedented second state visit to Britain in September because they are away on recess. Let them go and have a good time, he says. It's all very magnanimous, isn't it?
It was. He went on to say that his own goal for the state visit was to have a good time and to respect King Charles, who unsurprisingly, he thinks is a great man. All of this came when the White House phoned BBC reporter Gary O'Donoghue in the middle of the night to say that the president was ready to do an interview with him. This was on the anniversary of the assassination attempt, which appeared to be the turning point in last year's presidential campaign race for the White House last year. Gary was there, and the president, it appears, remembered and gave him the anniversary interview.
Gosh, I love the way he got it in the middle of the night. That is the Trump White House. I was actually around then, Sam. I was on my way to the Republican convention when that news broke. And really, the fact that it's a year ago, of course, seems extraordinary. Sent shockwaves through the system. And there he is, hale and hearty and about to arrive in the UK later this summer. The most consequential bit of the interview were the comments about Russia and NATO, where the president upholds the principle of common defence. Now he thinks other countries are footing the bill. He talks about his disappointment with President Putin. He says he's disappointed that there hasn't been a ceasefire. It's not done. That is a real shift of tone as we've been reflecting.
Yeah, the most striking bit was he was asked, do you trust Vladimir Putin? And the Donald basically pauses for what feels like an eternity and then just says, I trust almost nobody. That wasn't an impression, by the way. It's just a gruffly voice early in the morning. Anne, we had the head of NATO, Mark Rutte, in the White House yesterday. And this is such a shift from all those months of worrying about whether or not Donald Trump would stick to the principle of common defence, something that I think some of the people around him would rather wasn't there. But this feels like a sort of big and important commitment.
It is an important commitment. We did just pass a bit lightly over the fact that other people are paying for it. And that's very important to Donald Trump. That is the MAGA bit, I think, of this new compact, if such it is, in terms of more support for Ukraine. This idea that it's important to the Europeans, as he calls all of us. I always think it's probably, in the sort of Trump worldview, it's like Europe spelt with a Y. It's everybody, Europe. And that is important as long as the money keeps coming through from the European side, Britain pitching in there, but Germany especially. So I think, Sam, yes, it is a moment of inflection when he says, I trust almost nobody. Well, I think that is true of Donald Trump, full stop. But there's certainly none of that tone about, I understand Vladimir Putin. Yes, he's a tough guy, but I admire him. He used to sort of speak more in that concessional tone towards the Russian president, aka leader of an autocracy. Now that has all gone away, but it still comes back to the fact that America will be supportive, but it's going to be the European allies who are asked to stump up.
I just think it's a big win all round for Keir Starmer, if I'm being honest. Look, you've got a prime minister who's singled out for praise by the US president, who is notoriously fickle and difficult, having making that bridge with the White House a priority. You've got a US president who was fickle about NATO committing to it and doubling down on the basis of promises real and imagined about future defence spending, but nevertheless a win's a win, and he's got the president on the right side of things. And look, the strategy around Ukraine, which has been immensely painful for months, well, Donald Trump's language is now much more looked closer, in fact, to what Britain would want to hear than it had been months ago, where he seemed to be sort of equivocating and suggesting that Putin could be somebody he doesn't deal with. So, in terms of what we got from that overnight interview, I think they could be pretty pleased in Downing Street with where the president's ended up.
Yeah, I mean, we sometimes talk about glass half full, glass half empty on this. I think on this you're just a bit more bullish than I am, and that's probably a result of having spent so much time on on Russia, Ukraine. I mean, how long is this? Is this forever? Is this going to last? What does it mean in terms of? It's very hard to see only Europe stepping up there financially to defend Ukraine or to turn around the fortunes of Ukraine. That's all I would say. But if you're talking about from Keir Starmer's perspective, or if you like from the British government, John Healey also important there as the defence secretary, I think they have helped influence Donald Trump in this direction. And they've always said, don't trust Vladimir Putin. And now he says, you know what, I don't really trust anybody. So yes, good. I think it's a lot better than it was before. I probably am. I'm taking my vodka glass half empty at this time of the morning. Perhaps you're right to be a bit more upbeat.
I've given you glass half full. It might be the last time I ever do that. And so Downing Street should just take the win.
Yeah, it's not your normal vibe, actually. It's taken me by surprise. Anyway, onwards.
Today is Rachel Reeves' big day. It's the Mansion House speech a little bit later. Before we get on to all of that, I just want to highlight one other government policy announcement that's all over the news, all over the front pages this morning. And that is the new subsidy scheme for electric vehicles.
Yes, the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander, has announced that motorists will be given up to £3,750 to switch to electric cars. Now, drivers buying the new EVs with a list price of under 37,000, so not your luxury Tesla kind of things, but pretty much a lot of other cars on the market will be eligible in a program that's going to cost the government some 650 million. And this is a really nuanced idea because not every electric car, for instance, not the cheap Chinese made ones by BYD, which you see a lot around the place, they won't be eligible. The Teslas won't be eligible, etc., because they're too expensive to start with. But it is a return to a subsidy level for a lot of cars in the market, last seen between 2016 and 2018.
There's just one big thing I want listeners to this podcast to take away from this, because there's a statistic, Anne, that caught my eye. Now, last year, 20% of the market was pure electric cars. So 381,000 pure electric cars were purchased. But 80% of those were purchases by commercial fleets. And private buyers were only 20%. And now in raw numbers, that's 76,000 electric cars were bought by kind of ordinary people like you and me, out of a total number of cars, new cars sold of 1.9 million. So I just really struck the government's intervening because basically British drivers have not at all, as individuals, fallen in love with electric vehicles. And do you have an electric car?
I'm absolutely in that target group the government's probably trying to persuade. I keep thinking about it. I do an endless amount of late night research, get quite confused about range. Then I get range anxiety, which is one thing that really holds people back on this topic. And then I decide not to do anything about it, which I think is really decisive of the McElvoy household. But absolutely, there are just a lot of people who are concerned about that, where they're going to charge their vehicles. And there is this plan also to invest in more charging stations. But it has to be very decisive, doesn't it, to flip people over into a repurchase or a new purchase of an EV. And also they've kind of limited it a bit by taking some things out. You can understand the politics of not subsidizing the Chinese built EVs and not subsidizing Elon Musk, both of which I think could have been slightly more problematic headlines. But, it isn't intervention in the market. It reminds me a little bit sometimes in a sort of jokey way of kind of the old communist way of intervening in the market, which is saying, we'll give you money if you have this car. But it is obviously intended to move that money up the curve. It's staggering, relatively, how little that is, and I would not have known that. I would have put it higher.
Right, let's flip on to Rachel Reeves' big day. There's a lot going on here today. Do you want to just talk through the various things that are happening?
Yes, the head of the Office for Budget Responsibility is up before Parliament talking about the risks to public finances. You'll remember they did the big report last week on how pensions, public sector debt, and climate change are posing huge challenges for the government. Then, separately, Rachel Reeves will announce what she's calling the biggest financial regulation reforms in a decade, the Leeds reforms, effectively unpicking some red tape and also some rule tightening that was created around the 2008 financial crash. That'll be the big topic at the Mansion House speech. There's also that reference to Leeds as the finance hub outside the southeast and London, not coincidentally, I think, the home of Rachel Reeves' own constituency, and where she started her career in the mortgages department at HBOS. I think it's a sign there that Rachel Reeves wants to put a much more personal stamp on her reforms, not least after that Commons Day of Horror recently, and other ministers as well, I think, getting more profile, talking in more personal terms about their vision for Labour. We are seeing, I feel here, see how she performs later today, but this is the Rachel Reeves that we saw in election campaign mode, Sam. She's pushing herself as an enabler of working people, the social market for ordinary folk, Ludwig Erhard for the 21st century. It's quite strong personal messages, as well as that emphasis about it being good for other parts of the country outside the Northeast. Obviously, as your Northeast correspondent, I can only tell you that when anything is referred to by Leeds, George Osborne used to go on a lot about Leeds, and the government here, the Leeds reforms, the Northeast will go crazy because it feels that the government thinks that the country ends at Leeds. Small gripe.
We'll see how well that goes down. But there is also going to be, accompanying the speech, a set of announcements the government are going to make about home ownership and mortgages. In the Mansion House speech later today, Rachel Reeves will make it easier for banks and building societies to offer high loan-to-value mortgages, particularly for lower earners. Now, basically what we're doing here is we're unpicking the reforms that were introduced post the 2008 financial crash. So this reform will mean that it's Nationwide, who are the Britain's largest lender, will reduce the income threshold at which someone can borrow up to 6 times their salary from 35,000 to 30,000. So if you're on 30,000, you can borrow 6 times your salary. Now, the Treasury says this will lead to 36,000 more mortgages for first-time buyers a year. But it does mean that, once again, we're not dealing with the problem, which is stratospherically high house prices, and instead just making borrowing easier. And borrowing is inherently risky, particularly at those sums and those levels on that income. Is this all sensible?
Gosh, I think that's probably for better mortgage risk assessors than me to say. Certainly, the gap between earnings at the lower and even people going into the professions, a lot of graduates in that sort of group that you've just laid out there are on the numbers. So bringing it down from 35k to 30 will be welcome to them. But it does rely on people staying in work. And as you point out, it's quite a high risk market of mortgages. Anyway, it fuels the property market ahead of more homes being built. But we have heard a lot from lenders that they simply find this requirement to have such a lot of insulation on their books means that they're not able to lend. Then you have people saying, well, I can't get on the housing ladder, etc. So you've just got to hope that risk assessment works out. It'll be the first thing, I think, you might correct me here, Sam, that Rachel Reeves has put her face on, if you put herself behind, that has quite a high risk factor attached to it. She's done lots of things around that fiscal girdle that have felt uncomfortably tight. But this one, is the first time that she's perhaps put herself in a bit of jeopardy on that one. What do you think?
Well, it all depends on the health of the economy and the health of the public finances, which is you're basically, she's making a bet on things getting better. So that needs to come good. Now, all of this, I think, is overshadowed at the moment by Rachel Reeves and the black hole that she's facing in the public finances. And as we have endlessly discussed on this podcast, her own fiscal rules look like she's going to miss those by about £20 billion when they're reassessed at the budget in October, November time. That's an estimate by Bloomberg. Other people put it between 15 and £30 billion. And because she's just done a spending review and she had that catastrophic failure in the Commons to get welfare reforms through, it looks as if tax rise is the only way that she can fill that. And the discussion in private amongst cabinet ministers is how is the government going to square this circle? Now, I've got a bit of intelligence for you, but the starting point for this discussion, Anne, is The Mirror, which has got an interview with Rachel Reeves overnight. And in that interview, I feel like she is boxing herself in yet again. She restates that she's not going to break her manifesto commitments to working people. But also, she suggests that the level of tax rises in last year's budget, which were in the order of £40 billion, well, she basically says she's not going to repeat that. She says, last year I had to deal with the inheritance I faced, which included the black hole that the Tories left her. So it sounds like she's sort of saying to me, no big tax rises again. But then again, how is she going to deal with all of this? And again, boxing herself in doesn't feel sensible, does it?
Well, it doesn't seem sensible at all. Well, I feel you're dropping the lead. Do you? How can she do anything about this then? I mean, we've gone around this so many times. Right? I mean, everybody has argued about whether it was sensible to have them in the first place. Was there any wriggle room?
Well, I'm picking up suggestions that there might be. And what I'm about to say is going to be sort of is quite controversial and it's very in the weeds. So forgive me while I just spend a couple of minutes outlining. But the question I want to raise today is whether or not the fiscal rules are quite as ironclad as the Treasury and Rachel Reeves repeatedly assert. And the reason I said that I'm saying this is because I think that there is a wrinkle. There is a wrinkle, which is what exactly is the Treasury referring to when it refers to the fiscal rules? Because actually, if you followed this debate very closely, back in October, when the government released the fiscal rules, the new updated fiscal rules at the time of the budget, they actually released an 20-page document accompanying it with all sorts of different caveats and different exceptions. Now, the question is, could Rachel Reeves change some of those, effectively those caveats and exceptions? Do they count as fiscal rules that you can't touch? Or are there bits of the framework that she set out last year that could be altered, which allow herself to do a bit more borrowing within the rules? Let me explain what I'm referring to. Right. As listeners to this podcast should know by now, the main fiscal rule says that from 2029, the government's day-to-day spending needs to be in surplus. In other words, you can only fund it by taxation alone, not borrowing. That's the big fiscal rule that's caused her so much difficulty. But there's a little known buffer already built into those rules, which is that from spring 2027, if at the spring statement there's a deficit in 2029, then actually Rachel Reeves has a bit more wiggle room already, up to 0.5% of GDP. In other words, if from spring 2027 onwards, she misses her fiscal rule, she seems like she's going to miss her fiscal rule by 13 to 18 billion pounds, i.e. up to 0.5% of GDP, she will be judged to have met it under this small exception that previously not many people knew about. The markets know about it, but isn't widely known. But she is allowed to miss it, providing that at the following fiscal event, the following budget, she reduces that back to zero. So you've got this effective this exemption or this caveat or this get out of jail free card, but only from spring statement 2027. Now, I'm being told by some sources that some of the specifics around that might change. In particular, the date that comes into force. At the moment, this November, she can't reach for that. But could that change? Well, that entirely depends on whether or not you think this exemption is part of the fiscal rules or not. And I have spent quite a long time pressing the Treasury about whether the fiscal rules and the bits that are ironclad are the entire charter of the fiscal rules that was published in October, or just the very, very specific Fiscal Rule 1 and Fiscal Rule 2. And I've got a statement from the Treasury overnight. The fiscal rules, as set out in the Charter for Budget Responsibility, are ironclad and non-negotiable, as are the definition of the rules set out in the document itself. But I also understand from the Treasury that the Charter sets out other information not directly related to the rules, such as the role and remit of the OBR and the requirements for it to publish a specific list of fiscal metrics. So I still think it's a little bit unclear whether the definition of the rules encompasses all the bits of wiggle room and all the rest of it or not. And I certainly feel that I'm not being told that this is definitely and definitively wrong at this stage. So there could be some massaging potentially of the caveats and the exceptions and the get out of jail free cards around the fiscal rules. So watch this space. Certainly, they're watching very, very closely in the markets to see whether Rachel Reeves shuts this down.
Your supposition there is absolutely fascinating. You say it's a bit like one of those slightly minority sports where you have to argue about what's a rule and what's an interpretation. Didn't sound like that Treasury statement. Didn't say it wasn't. It kind of didn't say it wasn't, because it still comes down to a definition of what you factor in and what you factor out. So that's really shrewd sleuthing that you've been doing there in the weeds, and I'm happy to say you did it rather than me having to. But do you think she would want to make use of that? Can I just ask a really, layman question? I understand that's all the markets will know about this and be sensitive to it. Before Rachel Reeves, do you really want to get into that territory where you're having to do, make use of quite arcane interpretations in order to get the public finances back on a footing? How do you think that would? Do you see what I'm asking? How would that play out? I understand it could be seen as very smart by the Chancellor to have make use of this, or her team, but I could also see it coming across as like, you're really going to start interrogating what every word and rule means.
Look, it's that or tax rises, right? If this means that you have to raise taxes less...
Well, now you put it like that,
potentially that's a win. And I'm struck by the language in the Mirror this morning, which makes it sound like big tax rises aren't coming. Now, Anne, I've got another question for you. What's your definition of 20 minutes?
God, I think it's gone a bit phantom tollbooth today. Yes. Once you start talking about the fiscal rules, there's obviously an unwritten rule that when Sam talks about the fiscal rules, we're going to get an extra 2 minutes. But I think it was a really fascinating story. So we're going to give you that and just say a quick goodbye.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, we have used our extra wiggle room and our extra license, and we've redefined 20 minutes to include a little bit extra GDP. So we will see you tomorrow for Politics at Sam and Anne's on Wednesday after the Mansion House speech. See you then.
See you then.